right, so hello and welcome. Thanks for coming to the session. So I wanted to, apologize or give you fair warning. I actually gave this presentation and then posted the session description, and then since then I've changed a little bit of the content of it based on how I did it last time. So there's a tiny bit of a difference in the content for today's session and the actual description. Happy to chat with anybody afterwards about any of those details. But basically just wanted to focus a little bit more on just kind of teaching you, like spending time in New Relic, talking about how stuff works there, and less time talking about how to set up a sample site and how to tweak basic Drupal things. But again, happy to talk about that stuff if you're interested. Maybe afterwards or if there's time at the end. So I'm Oliver Seldman, Customer Success Manager at Pantheon. You can find me on some socials there. I will definitely be happy to discuss just about anything on this list. I mean, I have several other interests in life as well. But I love soccer and succulents and talking about cooking. So happy to be cornered and have any of those discussions. I still owe you a discussion, so let's make it happen before the end of the day. And so, as a customer success manager at Pantheon, I work with our enterprise customers. I help onboard them, help teach them how to use the platform, stuff like a little bit like how to use New Relic. New Relic is a separate product that we offer as a feature for certain sites. Basically, anything higher than a basic site gets it, but sandboxes get it too, so that you can kind of test before you launch. Even if you intend to use a basic site, but yeah. So I help get onboarded, learn how to use all of our tools, and also kind of work with them over the long term of the relationship, making sure they're kind of always have the opportunity to get the most out of Pantheon. Pretty basic agenda today. Talk a little bit about the whys. Talk a little bit about basic load test setup, how to think about it, and then review New Relic. We'll talk a little bit about some Drupal stuff in between. And there are two brief detours in this agenda that are sprinkled in the mix somewhere. Brief detours. So why? I mean, we're talking about performance analysis, we're talking about load tests. Like, when would we use this? Why would we use this? The biggest reason that in my job that I use is when a customer comes in and they're about to launch their site, and we want to make sure they're going to be successful. We will, find their, what their goals are, and we'll exceed them, and we'll work with them to make sure we can help identify anything, like any red flags in the lead up to launch, so that there's adjustments that can be made so that when they do launch, they have a very high level of confidence that not only are they going to be able to manage their existing traffic, they'll be able to manage twice as much, 3 times as much, whatever, we can work together on what those goals might look like. Another scenario is you have an existing site, but there's a piece of it that's slow. Your users are encountering this, your key stakeholders are encountering some issue with your site, and you want to, now we're not talking about load testing something, but we just want to understand what's wrong with something that's already there. Maybe another scenario on the load test side would be mimicking an anticipated traffic spike. My product is about to be featured on some show. We used to call it the slash dot effect, but this idea that somebody, either randomly or intentionally is going to flood your site with a whole bunch of traffic that you hadn't had before, and you want to make sure you're not going to fall down. Another scenario is adding a new feature. Maybe I'm adding this new thing, functionality-wise, to my site, and maybe it's a big, huge, heavy module, and I want to know what this new feature is going to do to my site. Or maybe I'm adding a new section with a ton of images and new marketing collateral, and I want to see whether that particular section of my site is going to make the rest of my site slow now. Another reason, and so in my previous presentation, I ended here, and because reasons was where I ended, and I kind of threw it out there. And actually, one of the audience members suggested SEO, which is a really insightful and legitimate reason you might want to reevaluate how your site's performing, because so much now is tied to how quickly your site loads, and there's a really strong sense that tweaks to your site's performance and page load time will greatly increase your SEO rating and how people experience your site on mobile, etc. So, but also I want to throw it out there to you as well. Also, looking for slide content for future presentations. No, but can anybody think of other reasons why you might want to load test a site or do some performance analysis on a site?
Accessibility, but maybe not the way we think of, like if we have a global audience, so someone might have a great internet connection.
Yep, accessibility for internet poor areas or something, just managing the entire world and not everybody having massive fast internet connections. Yeah, that's a great reason. Anyone else? Well, if you think of something, you can also interrupt, and we can add it to the list later. So today's focus: want a free performance audit? Cache your effing views. This is a joke, obviously. Mark is a longtime Drupal performance expert. This tweet is from back in 2012. So this has been a long-standing thing. And it's a joke, but it actually does a lot. There may very well be, if there is a kind of takeaway, caching is probably that major takeaway today. I mean, I know we're going to be talking about New Relic, but what you can get from your site is greatly impacted by how well it's cached. So caching is going to be our first detour. It's on the list of today's focus. Talk a little bit about what to enable, what to disable on Drupal sites, things to look out for, even on a basic Drupal site. Talk about how we're going to plan a load test, and then the new Relic concepts and a demo. All right, so here's the caching detour. So on the Drupal side, we have a couple of key things that you want to think about, just like vanilla Drupal related stuff. I'm talking a little bit about Drupal 8 here, but this is almost all relevant to Drupal 7 as well. So the first one is full page caching, and this is just like in your Drupal development performance settings. We'll go there and show it off. I'll do it right now, actually. You'll go into configuration, development performance. I'll make this a little bigger, maybe not that big. And this setting right here is this site is not being cached. My recommendation, something like 15 minutes. Your tolerance for how long things should be cached may vary. This is a good one. Also, with Drupal 8 and cache tags, there's a sense in which you can have this as a fairly high number, and then if you alter content, it invalidates the cache and updates itself. And so the risk of just leaving everything cached for a really long time doesn't you can avoid it affecting your content updates as well. So it's not like, oh, I made a post and now I have to wait 15 minutes for someone to see it. You also want to, I mean, while we're here, might as well aggregate our CSS and JSL. But the key about this feature here is that this Drupal's full page caching actually adjusts the header that Drupal puts out about what can be cached and how long it can be cached. And with this off, it actually has a no cache header. And what that means is anything in front of that is going to honor Drupal's header. So something like varnish that you have in front, or a CDN, these are features of Pantheon, but you may have your own versions of that. All of those are going to be looking for Drupal's headers around caching and honoring them. So if you turn this off, you're turning off your CDN. So this is an important one. Back to the pres. Another one is blocks. And blocks can be tricky because sometimes a block makes sense to be cached. It's a static thing. It has the same content. It appears in the left navigation of your entire site, across your whole site. Cache it. But maybe it's different. Maybe it's a type of block that has dynamic content, and depending on what section you're in, it loads, or depending on the user, or depending on what piece of your piece of content and how it's tagged, it may have different content in it. So how you manage this may alter how you think about block caching. But ultimately, the more you can do to cache them, the better. And then we get to views. So one of the awesome things about the new version of views in Drupal 8 is it comes with caching turned on. Mark's tweet from before in 2012, views did not come with caching turned on. It was something you had to actually actively go do. There was no such thing as cache tags. And so time-based tags time-based caching was the only way to do it. But now it comes with caching turned on. So that's awesome. However, you can create your own views, and there may very well be reasons why you wouldn't cache it at first. But when it comes time to your production environment, this is hugely important. There's also a massive gotcha with the new views cache settings, which is they come as tag-based settings, cache tag-based settings, which is awesome in theory. And Drupal 8 is much better at providing this kind of segmented caching so that different pieces can be invalidated at different times, and you're not just like all or nothing. Either clear all the caches or clear none of the caches. It allows you to get a little bit more specific. The problem with views is that they all use the same one. The way that Drupal is set up by default is that anything in a view that you set as tag-based, all the views use the same tag, which means you create a node, it invalidates one view, all your views are invalidated and have to be recached. So there is a module for that. It's called views custom cache tags. And what that does is, so the problem is that the tag itself is basically hard-coded into the views code. So what this module does is it turns that label, the tag label, into a form field that you can just change. So it allows you to tweak each, so depending on how you want, you could group some together, you could have them all be different, however you want, but it gives you that level of customization. There is one further gotcha to this, which is it does not invalidate the cache out of the box. If you go to the module page, there's a little code snippet that you can use and put in any custom module. It tells you how to do it. It's a couple lines of code. And it's an example, and it just gives you the kind of idea of the types of things you could do to choose when you would choose to invalidate the cache. I think the example is when you save a node, invalidate the cache related to that particular content type or taxonomy term or something like that. I mean, it's cool you can like use arguments or contextual filters, so like the view's tag can be related to like what term has been passed to the view or something like that too. Gives you a lot of control. It requires a tiny bit of custom code to make it work at the moment. In the future, that's going to be added to the module, but for now, it requires a little work. So the next kind of layer, like kind of going up the stack out towards the person who's requested our page, would be a kind of reverse proxy cache. In Pantheon's case, we use Varnish. There are other options, but Varnish is a standard. So this is on top of what Drupal is doing. There's like another layer that's taking a metaphorical picture of your page and serving that instead of actually calling up Drupal and asking Drupal to do it. And then one step further out is something like a CDN, where you would distribute those snapshots of your site across the entire internet to all kinds of points of presence all around the globe, so that when you request the site or you request the site, it doesn't matter where you're from, you're just getting it from the point of presence that's closest to you. So all of these things, you can see how we're kind of adding layers of performance based on caching. And in many cases, you may never even have to rely on some of this stuff we're doing. Just putting some of these things in place alone may make the difference between what was ordinarily a slow site and something that's blazing fast. While we're on the topic of CDN, there's something called a cache hit ratio. This is something on the Pantheon side that we're looking to figure out how best to expose to you, but it is an available set of information, which is how much of your traffic is the CDN catching, and how much of it is it sending through and requiring Drupal to load up again. And you'd be surprised. I definitely have encountered customers where I like ran the calculation and they were like 15, 20%. So 85% of the traffic was not being cached and was coming through and hitting Drupal. We can flip that around and cache 80% of the site. Drupal's really only in the background loading things that have changed or when something expires, and that's it. Then the CDN is handling everything. You don't even have to worry about it. It's blazing fast for everybody, and it's serving basically static pages at that point. No database calls, no nothing. So this is a huge thing to consider, and being able to dig in and actually get some of this information and understand and work with those numbers when you encounter them makes a really big difference. And finally, database caching. In this case, it's like called in-memory data storage, something like Redis or Memcache. In this case, so even if you're so one of the problems that everything I've been talking about now, we're talking about what an anonymous user will see, what this unauthenticated traffic coming in will get. Whereas sometimes it's slow for the content editor. Sometimes you try and load up your list of all content and it's slow for the people trying to use the site behind the scenes. So things like Redis and Memcache can help with that, and in fact can help with some of the anonymous traffic too, because what they do is you'll find these kind of common SQL queries, and instead of requiring the database to run that query, it caches that, and it serves that from in memory. So you're not having to continually rely on the database, and you're actually able to offload some of the most common things that are happening to a form of cache as well. And this really helps. There's Redis comes with quite a bit of logic around what stays in the cache and what gets bumped out of the cache. And there, as I said, there's some logic around what invalidates it, or maybe just evicts it because it's old. Any questions about the caching stuff before I move on?
Have you anything on using mod this cache out of Apache just as a, if you're not to the point where you need to say varnish or some external?
So I would say that any additional caching that you can provide to your site is going to benefit the outcome of how it works. Some is better than none. I will say that at Pantheon we use Nginx, and so some of that Apache-related stuff is kind of out of scope, so to speak. But whatever. And if you don't have some of these things, it's possible that like using something like Varnish would benefit you as well. But again, I've kind of talked about this as a kind of layering of caches, and so literally anything you can do to that process to offload some of that delivery to the server, instead of to the database, will improve things. So on the Drupal side, and I'm not going to really get into this too much. This is some of the stuff I changed. I basically created a dummy site. I added admin toolbar to make my life easier. I added Devel to generate some dummy content to test with. And then I added the advanced page cache module, which basically uses that full page cache setting that I showed you and helps make Pantheon's global CDN work with Drupal 8's cache tags even better, and just basically helps a Drupal site leverage Pantheon's caching at the edge. A couple things to think about disabling, and this is really here in the most vanilla of Drupal setups. So there may very well be a lot of things on your site that you might want to consider disabling, but maybe you want to. It's kind of a best practice to disable database logging on your production environment. Basically, just turn it off. If your site's running fine, you probably don't need to be logging stuff constantly. It is a debate, though, because then if something goes wrong, you have to turn it on before you can start collecting new log information. So maybe you're not in a position where you're comfortable doing that yet. If that's the case, there are some ways to improve things, which is just limit the results. By default, the watchdog result, it's like, I think it's 10,000 or maybe 100,000, a very high number of results that it's keeping track of. And that's adding to the database, that's writing more there, that's storing more, so when it comes time to grab that information, it takes longer. So maybe just lowering that to 1,000. Maybe you want to keep it on, you want to be able to keep track of the most recent stuff, but just finding a limit there that suits your needs that's lower, so that you're kind of doing less or requiring the database to do less. If you can turn it off, better though. And then maybe you could just go through and consider turning off a bunch of UI modules. And this pretty much falls under the if you don't need it on the production server to be on, just turn it off. Obviously, development modules, that type of stuff should always be off in production. But things like field UI, menu UI, and views UI, there's an argument for saying, just don't change these things on your production environment, ever. So turn it off and save all of that extra bootstrapping that Drupal's doing. Maybe that's not possible for you. Maybe, the argument maybe is that these are fairly insignificant in terms of how much extra memory they're using. So, but again, the kind of overall principle of if you don't really need it on production, probably turn it off if you can. Any questions about any of those recommendations? Cool. So let's talk about load testing. And again, so today my focus is a little bit more on the overall approach to this stuff and how we're going to think about it and how we're going to do it. And I will dive into some examples because I want to make sure to illustrate these things to you. But really the goal here is to understand how to think about these things. So Couple of major points of focus when setting up a load test is don't do it on your live environment. You don't want to DDoS yourself accidentally. You can crash your site if you've put a flood of traffic to it and you never tested it before. You can take your site down. So just don't do it on your live environment. I mean, Pantheon provides multiple environments. You have free sandboxes, so you could, spin up an extra account and an extra site and test it somewhere off to the side. Your host, your other hosting providers probably allow you to have other environments. Basically, figure out some other way to do this so that you're not doing it on your live site. Or, in the case that I was describing, do it before you launch. That's the best, right? You're not even live yet. So you have a live environment, you're testing it in the exact place that is going to be live, but it's not live yet. That's the ideal scenario. But there are a couple things to think about. You got to check for stuff like redirects and external service calls. Because in this scenario where you're saying, I'm not doing it on my live environment, I'm doing it over here in this other test environment that we've spun up, what about that external service call that you have a quota on? What about those redirects that are pointed to your live domain for some of the pages on somewhere? Or some content that is linking to images and files or something that are hard-coded to stuff on your live domain. You're going to test your test site, but it's actually going to be doing all of those things that we wanted to avoid on your live site anyway. So be careful about some of that stuff. And some of that stuff is only you can know. I can help you set something up. I can create a test site for you. I can load test it for you. But really, you know what's what. You know where things are. You know what APIs you're calling, what external services you're using. So use that knowledge as you're setting up your load test, and make sure that you're not accidentally calling things that you don't want to be calling, or pinging or taking down your live site. Just be careful about that. The other thing to think about as you're setting up your load test, and I alluded to it earlier, but use your traffic numbers. Go in and look at Google Analytics. Know what to expect. Know what you have already encountered. So as you design your load test, you're designing it for something that is appropriate for what you're going to get hit by. The way that we manage ours, we'll work with a customer and say, show us your Google Analytics, and we'll dig in for you, or just give us these numbers. But basically, I go back and look at your last year, and I find the highest spike anywhere in the entire year. I go into that day and either use that day or go into the worst hour of that day and find the worst amount of the worst that you've encountered. And then I break it down. So some load tests become like virtual users or virtual workers per second is usually the way that they're based. So I'll do a little simple math. Divide the day into hours, and the hours into minutes, and minutes into seconds. Find that number, and that's what we're going to try and hit your site. But then the thing is, we want to have confidence. We don't want to just know, hey, is my site going to go down when I get the normal traffic that I got on the worst day last year? I want to know if I can double it. Sometimes I'll quintuple it. Sometimes, depending on if the customer says we're ramping up and this year we're going to expand and we're going to put a bunch of marketing money in, we're expecting maybe 2 times. I'll test it at 10 times. Why not? Let's just see what happens. The worst that can happen is it falls down, and I'll tell them why. But most of the time, it gives them the confidence to know not only can I handle 2 times my traffic, I can handle 10 times my traffic. I can handle 50 times my traffic. My worst traffic, not my normal traffic. So sometimes just think about what your goals are and how it relates to what you're actually getting. And then build the test that way. The other thing is give yourself some time. Oftentimes, when I'm dealing with customers, they come in, they're like, we're going to launch tomorrow, can you do the load test for me? It's like, first of all, I got to do a lot of work to make it happen. But really, you want to plan for that time yourself. For me, when I'm talking to customers, I'm saying, maybe I find something that you're worried about. Maybe the test shows that this particular section of your site or this thing you're doing or this module is going to cause a problem when 2 times your worst traffic hits you. You want time to correct that. You want to be able to have a week or so with your dev team, with your agency partner, whatever it is, to say, like, we noticed this thing and we need to correct it before we go live. But that often isn't I just forgot to check the checkbox. It could be, we need to re-architect this thing. We need to change how this custom code works. Like, that's not always a one-day turnaround. So give yourself some time. Make sure you plan properly. Any questions about that? Cool. Well, here's my second brief detour. So, we've been talking about load tests as something we're going to do on a specific site for a specific purpose. We're going to launch it tomorrow. We're going to launch it next week. We want to do a load test. We want to do some performance analysis. This is just one piece of a much bigger picture for how the team works on the site, from developers to content editors to the marketing team members to your board members. Everyone around the project has some impact in how they use the site. And this testing piece falls into this bigger picture, particularly around automated testing. But this notion of being able to support the entire web team for the life cycle of the project, being able to iterate regularly, make changes with confidence, knowing that when add this new section to my site for the marketing team that they wanted, that has this big, huge image on it, I want to know, is it going to mess up my performance? And I want them to know, and I want them to be cool with it so that they can keep going quickly with it. So all of these things tie into this bigger picture, and I mean in this kind of bigger picture, we're talking a little bit more in the kind of test portion of the develop, test, release kind of regular life cycle of a website. But keep that in mind. Keep in mind that this doesn't have to just be a one-time thing. This can be part of a much larger continuous integration setup that you have with your site. Something that you maybe test every time you deploy a new feature, for example. To that end, kind of rounding out this bigger picture, I do want to simply highlight my colleague is giving a presentation, David, right over here. The next session after ours, we totally did not plan that. It was 100% coincidence, I promise. But he's giving a test on visual regression. He's giving a session on visual regression testing, which also features nicely into that kind of bigger picture, where you're maybe every time you spin up a new branch to do a new feature, when you commit your code, it does a quick visual regression test. And allows you, again, to launch this with confidence, knowing that this new change the marketing team made isn't going to break some other section of the site because they tweaked how the headers look or something like that. All right. Any questions about that before I dive into some New Relic concepts? Awesome. Okay. So before I actually do the actual, looking through New Relic, I just want to talk about some of the terms, some of the features of New Relic, how it works, what it's used for, that type of stuff. So first of all, and primarily, I'm going to be talking about APM here, which is Application Performance Monitoring, or Manager, depending on who you talk to. But the idea here is that it's a tool that monitors your site, the performance of your site, and it's a kind of ongoing thing. It's not I want to go check my logs from 2 years ago thing. It's a what's happening on my site right now kind of thing. How is my application doing today or yesterday or recently? But it's really focused on trending data. So it's the real-time stuff, what's happening right now. So if you are encountering slowness, go in and look. But that's what it's best for. And I will kind of talk a little bit about how to use the various time frames that it provides. The other really key thing to understand about this, this feature of New Relic, it's like one of their products, this APM. Actually, APM Pro is what comes with Pantheon sites. But it's a key way to just basically and at the highest level understand user satisfaction. How happy are my users with the site based on performance? And it's something called an AppDex score. So let's dive in a little bit to that AppDex score because it has a couple of really important aspects to it. So it is a user satisfaction index. It's not unique to New Relic. It's an industry standard concept. And it's based on the response time of your application, so it makes sense that this application monitoring tool will use this index. And it works with the notion, and there is an equation, and I'm happy to talk to you about how it calculates its number. But basically, there's a t-value score that you set. It comes as 0.5 seconds by default, so 500 milliseconds by default. And it basically says if your site loads, if your site responds in under that, you're 100% satisfied. And if it loads in anything worse than 4 times that, you're kind of not so satisfied, maybe questioning it. And if it's worse than 4 times that number, so if it's taking, in this example, 2 seconds to load or worse, they're unsatisfied. And it does a little math based on those things and comes up with a score from 0 to 1. So 1 is 100% of my traffic is receiving the page response times in under 500 milliseconds, everyone's happy. And a 0 would be everything's taking longer than 2 seconds. And then usually, most commonly, it's somewhere in between. Usually it's fairly high, at least for Pantheon sites. But there are a couple of elements about this notion that are significant. And the biggest one is some of the stuff that we're going to look into later is actually diving into a transaction trace. And the key thing here is that those transaction traces are only triggered for unsatisfied users. Only when a transaction passes the threshold of unsatisfied does a transaction trace get triggered in New Relic. So if you go in and you want to see, oh, this thing is slow, and your AppDex score is, or your t-value for the AppDex score is not set properly, it's possible that you could not have any transaction traces to look at. So it's key to understand this number and make sure it works for your site. Maybe your site is terrible and it's throwing so many warnings and the AppDex score is so low and all these transactions are triggered, it's almost overwhelming. So raise that number, start at the top, find the slowest things that are above that number, maybe set it to 1, so we're talking about 4 seconds, so only the things that are 4 seconds or slower we're going to talk about first. And then as you tune your site, lower that number so it matches, your response times. Get it so that you're getting basically set the number so you're getting meaningful information from it. Neither overwhelming nor empty and not enough. So let's talk about a little bit more about those key transactions and why they're important. So make sure in general, a transaction trace will be run when something's super slow. And you can dive in and start looking at it. But you can turn that transaction into what's called a key transaction. And there are a number of benefits associated with a key transaction. The first is just simple convenience. Once it's a key transaction, you can get to it easily. You can get back to it and refer to it, and you don't have to go through and find the transaction trace and go all the way through and identify where it was and where it came from. You're just tracking it already. There's a separate tab for it. You can find it. The other really key thing is that key transactions, ones that have been tracked, can have their own t-value and their own aptX score, which means, for example, if you find a key transaction and it's really bad, but there's only one of them, let's say, so you want the rest of your site to stay at the default 0.5, but you want this one particular one to have a slightly higher score or slightly lower score, whatever it is. Once it's a key transaction, you can go in and set the t-value on that particular transaction alone to be higher or lower, so you can track it differently from how you track the rest of the site, which makes a big difference for certain scenarios. The other thing is you can basically tag it, so you can organize them in groups of transactions. You can sort and filter and once it creates a list of these key transactions, you can manage them in a way that allows you to get to them easier. I guess this is kind of like lets you access them more quickly. It's a little bit redundant, but it's an additional element because you can kind of categorize and group them as is logical for your team. There also is some additional functionality beyond the regular transaction trace. A key transaction lets you compare these details like response time and error rate over time. So instead of like I'm just looking at it for this one little area that I'm talking about, it lets you kind of chart it a little bit and see how it's happened across a longer time frame and across multiple issues, maybe multiple pages. So this gives you a little bit more detail and more historic information as you're trying to figure out what the cause of this problem is. The other massive thing is that it lets you set up alerts. So, for example, along with that t-value setting for this, customizing the t-value for this particular one, you can say, if it passes this threshold, and this threshold for this one key transaction is different than the rest of my site, but when it does pass that threshold, send me an alert. Which is huge if you're actually trying to understand something, or this thing tends to be a problem, and you think you fixed it, but you're not sure, and you want to know if you haven't. So, very useful. And then, just talking a little bit more broadly about, I'm not going to get into any of these things today, but they are available in New Relic. And they're very useful. And so it's worth just kind of knowing what's possible, even though I'm not going to dive too much into it today. The first one is browser. So we've been talking about application performance, but that's only half of the puzzle. In fact, maybe it's not even half. Maybe it's only a very small portion of it. When you talk about the time to first byte on your site, a Pantheon site, or you have a highly performing site, showing 300, 400, 500 millisecond response time, let's say, or even better. But you have huge images and tons of JavaScript, and you're doing a lot of DOM manipulation with CS, it's very easy for you to still have 5-second, 10-second page load times, even though your server is blazing fast. So a lot of times, working on these kind of incremental performance-based things on the server will help, but you could also end up making these little minuscule differences when really taking that 2 megabyte image off of your homepage would have fixed the problem a lot more from the end user's perspective. So this tool lets you dig into the front end, basically do a lot of what we're talking about on the server side, but on the browser side. And this is also available. If you get New Relic on your own, it's like a separate product that you have to buy. It does come with, or at least a version of it comes with Pantheon. The other thing is synthetics. So we are talking about load tests here. One of the things to think about, so if what we're talking about now with like looking at the site and using your live traffic and faking a load test, you can also do that kind of in a synthetic way, using New Relic to, for example, ping a section of your site on a regular basis, and then use the reporting associated with it to send you alerts. And you can do this, for example, on an unreleased feature, something that doesn't even have traffic going to it yet. You can set up some synthetic traffic to go to it, and maybe even kind of just test out how this new thing is going to perform on your, on a multi-tab or on a test environment, or even on your live site in a hidden area. So this is a kind of, it's in the name, sending synthetic traffic to your site, maybe on like regular intervals. And it's pretty customizable and scriptable too, if you really want to dig in. The other thing is insights, which is a section for just kind of understanding understanding the data that's in New Relic, that New Relic has captured for you. And it's basically like a query builder for, it's like a version of SQL. I think they call it, I don't remember what it's called, but it's like new NRQL or something. It's like their own flavor of a query language. But basically, if you know how to do queries, you can use this to take the information that it has and dig in your own way, quite apart from the charts and reporting that it does. And then it also, it allows you to create a dashboard, and many of the charts you'll see, what I'll show about, you'll notice when I hover over it, it says add to insights, add to insights, add to insights dashboard. So as you're using New Relic and you see these things that are helpful to you, just add them to your insights, and then be able to go to this insight section later and kind of build up your own kind of custom dashboard for how New Relic works. All right, let's get into some demos here. Anyone have questions about that before I dive in? Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to mention was that, let's maybe make this a little bigger. So I was using this tool. This one is called Load Impact to build a load test. And there are a couple things here. If I maybe can go to a previous one, it'll show you what it did. It actually is giving me some trouble right now, so I'm not going to actually run a load test at this moment. I have some that I ran previously. We can look at that. We're actually going to maybe look at your site anyway, so we may not even get into one of the ones I sent load traffic to. But you can see here, in this case, there's a freemium model for this particular product where you get a certain number, 100 different tests, and each one is 5 minutes, and you can send 50 virtual users per second, which is actually a massive amount of traffic to your site for 5 minutes. It slowly ramps off and then cuts off, and you can see this green line is how it's identifying how your server responded while it was sending all that traffic. Here's a spike where I cleared the cache, for example. But the key here in looking at how we set up this load test is, so the first part is how, what I talked about as you were, it is not loading happily right now, and I may end up, there we go. So one of the things I talked about in terms of shaping the load test was deciding how much traffic to throw at. The other part is, what do we do with the traffic when it gets there? We at Pantheon use a tool called Locust, which is an open source Python-based tool, and we spin up a bunch of Google Cloud instances with this tool on it and send a bunch of traffic to your site. And we actually script what is going to happen when the traffic gets there. 5% of it goes and does a search. A certain percentage of it will go and hit these 5 landing pages. In this case, you can see here that in this load impact, they set up these what are called scenarios, and here it's testing the home page, and it's actually gone in and found all the assets on the home page, and it's gonna go and grab them. And then you can see here, I built basically a 3 scenario load test here. My sample site had 3 pages on it. I built an articles page and a pages page, just as an example. But you can see here, now I'm specifying that a certain percentage of the traffic should also go hit this page. And in load impact, you can just create these scenarios and then say how you want to distribute the traffic across those scenarios. One of the things we do with Locust is we actually, because you're using all of Python, so we actually send it to a home page, tell it to scrape the links from the home page, from the menu and that it finds on the home page, and then go to a random 10 of them, and then disconnect, leave, and let the next worker go. And so the idea is, even 10 is like way more than most people would hit a site. So most sites get like 2 or 3 clicks in terms of how deep a person will go before they disappear. So this is like again kind of pushing the limits of what you'd expect an average user to be doing. But again, focus this on what's meaningful to you, and that can be different. This could be maybe your site has an app in front of it, and you want to do this with some API endpoints. That's just as relevant. But again, think a little bit about what you're going to use the test for, what sections you want to test, match it to the kind of traffic trends that you already know about. All right, I'm not going to get too much more into that, but let's go and actually look at this. Thank you very much. What was your name, by the way?
Amelia.
Amelia, thank you very much for allowing us to use you as a guinea pig. We can just look here at her site, and I'm just, I'm going to go a little bigger here. So a couple key things. When you get dumped into New Relic, this is what you see by default. So first of all, you're on your overview page, and you're looking at this window here of the last 30 minutes. And then this big chart is your web transactions. And so there are a couple key things to notice here. We're here, the site is performing in under 300 millisecond response times, so very fast. You can see here that this orangey yellow part is MySQL. And then this whole blue area is PHP responding. And you can hide pieces of it. I only want to look at what MySQL is doing, or I only want to look at what PHP is doing, etc. And you'll see here as I move along the bits here, and so in the 30-minute window, each of these points is 1 minute. And so you can see here as we go along, we're getting information. I'm going to try and point to it now, but it's moving. But in the little response times box, we're getting information like response per second and actually how many transactions, in this case 13.6, are coming through the site at any given moment. And you can see as we are moving along the line here, it's also moving, and I can't point because I'm using my cursor for this, but you can see in the AppDex score section, it's moving along as well. And you can see here in the throughput section, it's moving along here as well. So I can, for example, identify this little spot right here, which was the worst throughput. So the most traffic in the last 30 minutes came here, and it's consistent with a slightly downward trend on AppDex score. And immediately following that was a slight uptick in server response time. So it was a little bit slower. A bunch of traffic came in, things slowed down a tiny bit, people were a tiny bit less satisfied. So you can see how by kind of combining these different charts, you can start to really dig into what's slow and how we can actually garner useful information about what's happening. Here's another one in the last minute. Did you just access your site, maybe? So you can see here actually there's very low throughput, but the aptX score dropped and there was a big spike in traffic. So as we're digging in to these details, this is how we're starting to identify what to look at. Another key thing to note is all of this stuff, all the transactions we're going to look at, the modules and hooks, everything that we're looking at is all based on this time picker. So if I change this here, let's look over the last 24 hours.
So you'll see interesting in 3 months.
Yeah, so you look under the last 24 hours. Now, if I go to transactions or I go to slow modules or whatever, that's going to now be reset for the last 24 hours. And then instead of every 1 minute, these little chunks actually are every 10 minutes. Each blip is a 10-minute blip now. I mean, yeah, let's go. We may not actually have information for 3 months if you only moved to Pantheon recently.
Oh, no, I've been...
Oh, okay. So there is a chunk of time way back when it was really bad. Well, not that bad.
That's the end.
This is the end of the mountain coming way down. Okay, well that's good. I mean, it's good to see there's nice performance going on here. But in this time, so this is the average response time. Let's see if there were any transactions in this time that passed the threshold. So we see here that over the course of the last few months, the worst problem, the slowest transaction here is related to Page Manager Page Execute, which I probably could have told you if you had told me you had panels on your site.
I have 2. I hate that.
Well, that is not to ding panels. I am actually a very, at least in Drupal 7, I was a big fan of panels, but they have to be used effectively, and they aren't always. So they can tend to be a problem. But so we can see here, we clicked on this slow transaction. We get the breakdown of this transaction. You see here, for example, I can click track as key transaction, and now from now on, that's that whole key transaction thing I was talking about. Now we're tracking it. You see here, as I'm mousing over this chart or that chart, add to insight to dashboard. This is what I was talking about before. But let's get into this transaction trace here. So on the front page, this is taking 4 seconds to execute.
Oh my God.
Let's figure out why. So the first thing that pops open is this new little transaction trace modal window. Again, once we're in here, we can always use this button to track this as a key transaction. We can see here the basic stack. I mean, the transaction trace of what happened, what was called, what are the major pieces of this transaction are identified here. Maybe what called it and some kind of, contextual information about the request. But the real meat is in this hidden tab. And this is why one of those things where, unless somebody shows you to look here, you would never think that, the meat of this whole thing is in this second tab within a modal window. That's where we need to go, but that's where we need to go. And you'll see here, it actually pulls this whole thing down and basically does a little waterfall of the slowest piece of the entire transaction, literally everything that had to be called to pull this page together. And it usually, depending on the transaction, usually highlights a piece of it that was the slowest. In this case, it was, I don't know, I'd have to look at this a little bit more. This is like some bit of Apache Solr that was being used, it looks like, to pull something in. Maybe it's possible that this homepage has a search piece to it. I mean, again, some of this is guesswork. Obviously, as I'm not on her dev team, so it's hard to know.
I just inherited this, so the
Maybe you don't either. Okay, that's cool. But again, the point of this is just to like see, like, how do we get at the information that's valuable to us? Where do we go to look for this stuff? And you can go here and like each of these things, you can click on it and pull it down and pull it down and pull it down and continue to dig into each of these pieces until you find the part that is the function that will help identify what's slow. And there's one other thing to note is this little permalink button here. So if you wanted to send this to your dev team, for example, you click this permalink, you grab it, and you paste it into a link to them. They can log into New Relic and get right back here to this exact screen. So I'm basically wrapping up here. The last few things I wanted to note is it's smart enough to know about Drupal. So there are things like you can click on modules and it tells you, it does this for modules. Hey, surprise, surprise, views is your slowest one, and some of them are taking 14 seconds to load. Probably need some views caching, I'm going to guess. You can look into specific hooks. Again, dive in. Oh, it's a block. One of those views, the views that was causing this problem, is probably a block that is on every page in the sidebar and is not cached or pulling dynamic information, something like that. You can see here how this becomes really helpful, and you can start diving in. There's also a section for databases as well, which basically does the same thing, but helps you investigate the slowest queries. So I am out of time. I definitely want to make some space for the next speaker. That is me. Thank you very much for joining me and talking about this stuff. I'll be around for the rest of the day, so I'm more than happy to talk about all of these details with you in much more depth, if you like. Thanks for coming.